Namaskar. We live in challenging times. There's difficulty in creating jobs. There's a global economic slowdown. One of the big engines of growth, China, is slowing down. India is being looked at as the bright spot in the global economy. But is it creating enough jobs? And is it a big enough engine for the rest of the world? To understand how this is all affecting employment across the world, we have with us Mr. Guy Ryder, who's the Director General of the International Labour Organization. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
India, the bright spot, and 7.6% growth. But the ILO in its update says that this should translate into a better labour market conditions. How?
Well, let me start by just picking up on your introduction. You're right, we have seen, really since 2008 and the global crisis that hit the global economy then, a major slowdown in the global economy. And you're right, India bucks the trend here. 7.6, it's the fastest growing major economy in the world. China has cooled off, let's put it like that, but by choice, by conscious choice, I think.
True.
Other continents are in much bigger difficulties. We see Latin America going into reverse, in fact, no growth whatsoever. Europe stagnant. So India is a bright spot in that regard. The global situation is one of very high unemployment. We're around the 200 million mark in terms of global unemployed. And the bad news is it's not getting better, it's getting worse. We talk about sort of recovery from that 2008 crisis. In jobs terms, it's really not happening. Now, India does look good in this global perspective. But I think it's right that India, in addition to trying to keep up this very creditable growth record, looks to its own labour markets. And if you look closely at the labour markets, you see there are major challenges. And it's, of course, the number of jobs India can create, but it's also the types of jobs that are being created
Certainly.
here. And anybody who comes to India, like myself, of course, the first thing that really strikes you is a high level of informality in the Indian economy. People here put the figure at 92, 93%. Well, you've really got to dig down and look at the disaggregated situation of the economy.
So what you're saying is that, growth driven by the formal sector can be regulated to some extent, but not growth driven by the informal sector. And let's say our growth in India is largely driven by the informal sector, and the jobs are more self-employed.
Well, not necessarily quite like that. My view is that we need to be looking at formalisation, and the Prime Minister has said as much in his budget speech recently. India needs to be looking at formalisation because the informal economy is all too frequently synonymous with poor quality employment, unacceptable working conditions. Now, it's rare, frankly, that informal economy drives growth. I mean, India's growth engine will come from other parts of the economy and is coming from the other parts of the economy. And that is really the story here. The point I'd like to make, and it's true of the global economy in general, if you just look at the headline figures of economic growth, that is not a good proxy of your job creating potential. You need the growth, but it's the type of growth you get and the types of structural change that you bring about under the impetus of that growth.
Also, what's happening in India, according to the ILO update, is that agriculture to marketing, that shift, is not taking place fast enough. 48.9% still employed in agriculture, and the GDP contribution of agriculture has fallen quite significantly, 15.4%. But, I ask you, should India be a manufacturing hub when it's actually, if you go to any of the stores, all the products are in surplus? I mean, there are enough products. They're all being produced by our country for domestic demand. There's enough being exported as well. What will we be creating this manufacturing for?
Well, you're right. You're right to focus in upon this process of structural transformation. True. I mean, the classic scenario is that labour force moves out of low productivity, rural, agricultural occupations into others. The interesting thing in India is it's not following the same sort of structural transformational path as other economies. The area where we're seeing big employment growth in India is construction. People are moving out of the rural economy. There has been a shrinkage of the rural economy. But the manufacturing sector remains perhaps less big than one might expect, and I think that this is certainly an important area. I don't think that you can take the view markets are saturated, there's no need for this.
Sure.
I think that Make India has a lot of very good sense to it. But it is quite clear to me that India will not follow, for example, the Chinese part. It is not going to become the mass industrial hub, the workshop of the world, as we tend to say, partly because the economy is different, partly because India has other options. The very large service sector, of course, is dominant in India, and partly because industry is changing in the world. I mean, with technological change,
Sure.
the notion of the mass employment industrial sector as it existed 20 or 30 years ago is probably misplaced in today's conditions.
You say industry is changing, and one of the things that we notice is that the formal sector too is employing people largely on a temporary basis, on contracts. How does the ILO look at this? Because I mean, is this formal or informal?
Yeah, we've got what looks like a contradiction right now, that the informal sector as such is actually getting smaller. People tell me 82% of people are in the informal sector, but we're getting informal employment in the formal sector. It sounds like a contradiction, but with complex casualization or contracting mechanisms in the formal economy, in formal enterprises,
right,
you're actually generating informal economy. And that makes up the margin between 82% of Indian workers in the informal sector and 92 or 93% in informal employment. It's a subtle difference, but here's the point. You have to look about what is happening in the formal economy, in the formal sector. Look at casualization, look at contractual forms. And these are areas which are very complex, but I think need to be examined by India, as indeed in other countries. If we see an erosion of the employment relationship, if I don't know who is my employer, if my employer does not have responsibility for my working conditions, my pay, my social protection, then you're liable to have the generation of employment forms that do not meet the thresholds of what is frankly acceptable.
True, and social justice is the core mandate of the ILO, and you're going to be 100 years in 2019. Right. But let's say in these 97 years, how is social justice, how much social justice has been achieved?
Well, you're absolutely right. We're the oldest of the international organizations, founded after the First World War, a global conflict. And the notion behind the ILO was that if you don't have social justice, a minimum degree of fairness at work and in society, then you're going to have instability, you're going to have conflict, and indeed, from the experience of history, you're going to have war. And we have seen nearly 100 years worth of tripartite interaction. Our organization brings together not only governments, but uniquely in the world, the representatives of workers and of employers in this process of social dialogue. Now, what about how far have we got? I guess that's the sense of your question. Look, there's no denying that we have transformed and improved the world of work. There are fantastic improvements to be shown in terms of prosperity, in terms of worker protection, in terms of living standards. But there are also massive challenges still out there. People ask me, well, when will we get to social justice? My view is it's like a receding horizon. We have to keep working because we're never going to get to that destination in your lifetime or my lifetime. Okay. It's an ongoing struggle. And indeed, the further we get, the further we have to go, because the notion of social justice is one of progress, and you never get to the end of that. And
in these global uncertain times, in the digital age, would you say that the gap between the rich and the poor has increased, or has the inequality decreased? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because you have to look at these things in two terms, the absolute terms. Are we conquering poverty? Are we getting people out of poverty? The answer is yes, we are. We've made major inroads into global poverty. There's still a lot left to do, and when the United Nations adopted its development agenda up until 2030, it made the overarching aim that of eliminating extreme poverty. So we are doing better. But you've put your finger on the other dimension of this story, which is relative. It's about inequality and inequity. And the fact of the matter is, our societies are getting more unequal. There is greater difference between rich societies and poor societies. And this also produces feelings of injustice and feelings of conflict. So we have to look at these issues of inequality as well. Unfortunately, our labour markets are generating more inequality not less inequality right now.
Well, Mr. Ryder, one of the other concerns is the gender gaps in terms of employment, and that is also increasing, isn't it? In terms of, some people would look at this differently and say that because the homemaker, the role of the homemaker, I mean, women are 100% employed, but the homemaker's work is not being monetized, and hence, as a result of that, you're looking at it as if there's less employment from the female. But I think that's probably not true, isn't it?
Well, again, two major questions there. What is the situation about women in labour markets? Well, in India, the gap between male and female participation rates in paid work is very big. India is a member of the G20 group of major economies. There is only one other country in the G20 which has a lower participation rate of women, and that's Saudi Arabia. So India has very low participation rates in paid work. And that is something which needs to be looked at. And by the way, the bad news is, rather than getting better, that level of participation is going down. And we have to understand why. Our information indicates it's got to do with developments in the rural, the agricultural economy, where women are withdrawing. So there is a big problem. Now, the second point, and you're absolutely right to point to it, is it's not that women are doing nothing. They're very frequently working at home in non-monetized, unpaid work, care work, household work. And this is simply not recognized. I mean, in our GDP figures, we don't look at it. It's not valued. And I think that one of the major developments in the world of work, and one of the issues which is coming more to the fore, is the valuation of unpaid labor, and particularly the development of the care economy. This is going to be something, I think, that we're going to be concentrating on a lot in the future. But the ILO's position on these matters is that women should have equal access to labour markets, they should have equal opportunities, and above all, they should have equal pay and conditions, and we're a long way from that.
Okay, one of the issues of globalization is that it's created a product, like you were talking about make in India, but it's actually make in the world.
It is.
Since everything's made in the world, the supply chain is from everywhere and it's just assembled in different countries. Now, how does this change the way we have to look at the labor market? Shouldn't, like capital moves, labor also, shouldn't it also be able to move as easily?
Well, we had a major discussion in our conference last month in Geneva, the ILO's annual conference on global supply chains. The first time the international community has tried to address the questions that you have just put. What I think we see as a fact in the world of work is that production is now fragmented. As you say, you buy a car, you can't really say it's made in Germany, made in India, made in China, made in the UK. As you've indicated, it's made in the world because we are fragmenting production systems and creating these value chains where production is added along the road. Now, does this matter? You could say this is a natural part of the global economy, it's a natural part of the free flow of capital and of goods. And I think there is a lot to be said for that. The question arises, though, is what implications does this situation have for the regulation of working conditions? There are those who would argue that when it is possible for supply chains to operate across national jurisdictions, the operation of those chains escapes the type of protection available in national production. They're able to escape governmental regulation. Now, we have a difficult conversation in the ILO. There are some who would say, look, there is nothing new about global supply chains, or at least no new implications for labour market regulation. Each country must do its job. Each country must have the right types of laws and apply those laws. So it's all about national capacities. And there is another point of view, and we saw this sort of coming together of these views, this other point of view that said, no. There are actors operating across national jurisdictions. There are logics, there are actors who are able to play off, if you like, one national jurisdiction against another. And we have to seize the logic of this, I would say the transversal, the horizontal logic that is at play in these supply chains, and hold those to certain standards of behaviour. Okay. The question is then, how do you do it? But I think that debate is open, and I think it will continue. It's going to become a big part of our work programme.
Well, the concern is that, let's say, a country like India, for instance, is a young country, and we have about 800 million people under the age of 35,
yes,
which means that they all have to work. And, I mean, not all of them can work in India. So, I mean, the chance of moving to other parts of the world is also on their minds, and shouldn't that be a possibility?
But now you're pointing to migration and labour mobility rather than global supply chains. And indeed, and it's been one of the subjects that has come on the table in my discussions in the last 2 days here in Delhi. India clearly is a country which is in a position, and I think intends, to provide labour for migration. Now, I consider, and I think most people would consider, that migration is a necessary and a positive part of the operation of the global economy. The challenge is not to have more or less migration. The challenge is to make sure that migration takes place in acceptable conditions. And if there is one thing, in my opinion, that the international community has not done well in this age of globalization, it is managing migration. Too frequently, migration takes place in unacceptable conditions. When it's illegal, of course, that adds a great deal more problems. But, and the international community is now focusing upon this. I think it is one of the major pending issues that we look better at how to manage the process of migration. And this is a matter which I think India can play a very, very important role in. Government-to-government agreements from sending and destination countries is one way of doing it, but I also think that the international community needs to set a better framework for the management.
Have the priorities changed? Let's say after Brexit, for instance, and one of the reasons was because of migration.
Yeah.
So have the global priorities changed in this matter?
Look, the way I always look at this is to say that the economic case in favour of migration has never been stronger, partly because of differential demographics. There are some countries with fast-growing young populations, and there are other countries whose demographics are stagnating.
Sure.
And that makes migration an obvious solution to labour excesses and shortages. So the economic case is terribly strong, but political and social obstacles are getting greater as well. And I'm afraid, and I'm not happy about it, let me be honest, Brexit is a manifestation, in part, there's more to it than that, of social and political obstructions to migration. And so I come back to the point I previously made. We have to manage migration better. We have to make sure that the rights of the people who do migrate are protected, and that's probably the number one priority.
Okay.
But at the same time, we have to make sure that when they go to other countries, they are not exploited, they are not undercutting local labour market conditions. And in fact, the two things are two sides of the same coin.
If we talk about the extreme poverty debate, and I think the ILO figures say that 319 million people still live on less than $1 a day. So that's clearly shows that the social justice mandate has not quite achieved. But would you say that, the problem is really with governance models across the world?
Partly so. I think there are two things I want to say about extreme poverty. The first thing, and by the way, you're right, we're nowhere near the end of this story, but we've come a long way. And I repeat that the international community has given itself the commitment to eliminate poverty, extreme poverty, by 2030. But two things to say about it. Firstly, if we're going to get to really the eradication of extreme poverty, we have to get to those parts of our communities which have proven very difficult to reach. So it's the rural, it's the informal, so that speaks very loudly to India. It's also people in conflict situations, very, very high concentrations of extreme poverty in countries afflicted by conflict of one type or another. So we have very, very consciously to focus on the hard to reach. We shouldn't put them aside, we shouldn't forget them, we need to focus on them. The second point is, and this worries me, 1/3 of the people living in poverty in the world today have a job. And here's the problem. Having a job is no longer, if it ever was, a guarantee of getting out of poverty. We have to look at the quality of jobs. We have with us now the working poor as a major problem.
Okay.
And that takes me back to the point I made earlier. It's not about creating jobs, it's creating the decent quality of jobs as well.
And in democratic societies, when there's huge unemployment, would you say that the government is responsible to create jobs, or or to create an environment for jobs? Because at the end of the day, people are going out to vote and they want a job when they are voting, and they don't get that job.
Yeah, governance is extremely important in these issues. And you cannot come to India without remarking on the vibrance of democracy in your country. So I think that democratic governance is a key to success in overcoming poverty. But I think people have got past the stage where they think that it is the job or even within the possibilities of government to create jobs directly. We're not looking to the public sector directly as employer. The vast majority of jobs will be created in the private sector. I think those countries which are having most difficulty in generating jobs, particularly for their young people, are countries which have failed to generate this enabling environment for private enterprise. But there is a synergy between the two. There is a synergy between the two. The government has to create the right conditions, but it's not the provider of jobs in general for the mass of the population who need access to employment.
Well, one of the solutions is to create a 24-hour cycle for almost all industries and make the country work 24 hours. Is that a fair way of looking at things when, from the labor point of view, or is it unfair?
I wouldn't say that's a panacea. I mean, there are some types of occupation which by their very nature are required to work around the clock, and you have to accommodate that reality, and you have to organize work around it. But I do not see the 24-hour economy as the overall model which we're going to have to be following in the future.
Sure.
India has this, of course, this terrific possibility. I wouldn't say it's the overall solution, but you've got this terrific high-tech capacities and talent and bases. I think that's a terrific opportunity for India. But the whole story goes much wider than just that high-tech, round-the-clock economy.
So the ILO has initiated some conversations with regard to the Future of Work initiative, so that by 2019, when you complete your 100 years, you'll find some sort of solution to all these global issues with regard to employment. Let's look at some of them briefly. You talked about work and society, and that deals with conditions of workers leading to death, forced labor, child labor, and such issues which still exist. Could you elaborate on that, work and society?
Yeah, as you say, we're looking to our centenary not just to celebrate, but to look to the future. And let me say that what we're trying to do is to identify those, we call them the mega drivers of change, those factors which are bringing about transformational change in the world of work. I think everybody would agree that today we're facing change of a speed and of a depth that we've never seen before. I can see 3 or maybe 4 mega drivers of change. One is technology. People seem to agree, they use different language, that we're on the cusp of a 4th industrial revolution, and that this technology, like all technological revolutions, will destroy some jobs and create others. But this technological revolution, I think, has something new in it, because it has within it the capacity to transform the way work is organized. We are talking increasingly about the gig economy or the platform economy, whereby production is organized around virtual platforms. And if that is true, I think it has the capacity to transform the organization of work, and therefore we have to relook at all of our institutions and all of our legislation. So technology is one. Demography, we've talked about that already, and more particularly differential demography, I think, is another issue. Some populations growing, others not. The third, we haven't talked about it, is climate change. The fight against climate change will constrain how we produce in the future, but also offer new opportunities. And we have to factor that into our equations. And the last piece, and this is more subjective, I think for the last 20, perhaps 25, 30 years, we've considered globalization, and ever more intensifying globalization, as the correct, the necessary, and perhaps the inevitable way of organizing our global economy. I think today that assumption of ever increasing, ever intensifying globalization, I would put it no more strongly, it is questioned for social reasons, for perhaps security reasons, for political reasons. I think people are reconsidering and drawing back. I see a growth of protectionist sentiment. I see a growth of nationalist sentiment. Now, I don't say this is stopping globalization, but it's certainly presenting question marks. And if that is the case, and if it's something which is not simply a temporary phenomenon, then I think that will affect quite fundamentally the future trajectory of our world of work. And if there's one lesson that I've learnt in this exercise, it's not to be too confident about your predictions. The world is unknowable, the world is uncertain.
Okay, well, the other conversation is about decent jobs for all. I think you've addressed a little bit of that as well. But there is the fear that, the words of the ILO, that the global jobs machine has broken down. Can it be repaired?
Look, at current rates of economic growth, and India is at 7.6, but the global economy is at 3 point something. It goes up and down, 3.2, 3.6. At that rate of global growth, we are not in a position to create enough jobs for the 40 million plus people who come onto the labour market every year. It simply won't happen. It's almost like a mathematical equation. So the global jobs machine is not operating to the levels of efficiency that it needs to get everybody into decent work. That's one thing. But as I've said in our conversation specifically about India, yes, the quantity of jobs is fundamentally important, but it is also the type of jobs that we are creating. And I think we have to overcome this notion that there is a necessary playoff between the quantity of jobs and the quality of jobs. We have to reconcile the two. We need more jobs, but we need better jobs. At the moment, the global economy is definitely underperforming in that regard.
Okay, so what about organization and work production? Does it cover, also the small and medium sector to a large extent? Large companies, are they sustainable? How do you look at this? Because, the big companies also are collapsing.
Well, the first thing to say, and I think it's a challenge for the International Labour Organization, is that we know that most people are employed in small and medium-sized enterprises, sometimes micro enterprises.
Sure.
And very often, and I think it's understandable why, these small enterprises don't get heard. Their voice doesn't get heard in policy making. We don't get to the workers. They're very often in the informal economy. We have, I think, to put the accent upon promoting small and medium-sized enterprises and ensuring that they give working conditions which are acceptable. Again, it's this question of reach. We have to
theoretically,
get to
are they
people.
more sustainable at this time?
Well, look, it's a complicated story because there's a high rate of mortality in startups in small enterprises. Some are born and they die very young. Others take off, the gazelles, we know these stories. Whether they're sustainable or not, they're clearly the place where most entrepreneurial dynamism exists. Now, this is not to deny the importance of the big enterprises, the household names that we all know. These are important. These are major players in the global economy. They are major providers of employment as well. So my answer to your question is we don't focus on one to the exclusion of the other. We have to look across the whole spectrum of enterprise development and work out how we can help them to help us all to create jobs.
My final question, you follow the tripartite arrangement where you bring in employers, employees and government as stakeholders. How is the ILO working with India to create job-driven growth?
Well, I'll be meeting with your social partners later in my visit, later today in fact. Look, this is the way the ILO does its work. It has done for nearly 100 years. Governments, employers and workers sitting together, working out solutions. Now, when this works, it produces really very, very valuable results because I think the act of consultation, the act of dialogue brings legitimacy to decisions made because people have had a say. It brings balance, fairness, because people's voices and interests have been accommodated. And I think that it actually takes us forward. But it requires a lot of effort. It requires an investment of time and resources, which frankly in some cases government are not ready to give. They regard a tripartite discussion, I heard it described once as a conspiracy against good decision making. I don't take that view, but I do recognize that it requires time and effort, and perhaps even more importantly than that, it requires a readiness to listen and to compromise. And I worry sometimes that that becomes more and more difficult when particularly governments are under pressure for results and quick decisions. But my advice is persevere with dialogue. It works.
Mr. Guy Ryder, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.